Welcome to Lesson 24 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to refactor our application just a bit. Refactoring just means that we're going to rework our code so it does the same job, but in a better way. We've got some junk I want to get cleaned up in there, and now is the time to do it. Along the way, I want to improve a couple of areas that aren't quite up to standard yet. So let's get started. The first place I want to start is this iData connection. Remember at the beginning, we started passing back the same model we passed in. The thought process was, well, we updated the model, therefore let's pass it back. And that's just really not necessary because we already have the model's address. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start deleting things. I'm going to delete the return type and say void instead. And I'll copy that and paste over these other two. Now it's going to break both the SQL connector and the text connector because the signature line has changed. Remember that this signature line has to match what we have in each of our implementations. So for example, the iData connector will now yell at us. So let's change this to be void. And now we have a return model and it says, hey, you can't do that. No problem. We don't need to return it. Create prize model, we'll set that to void. Take away the return model. And take away this return model and set it to void as well. And that should take care of our interface. Let's go over to the text connector and do the exact same thing. So we're going to change this to be void. And don't return the model. Change this to void. Don't return the model. And then down here, create team as well. And don't return the model. And now it should be that, again, iData connector is satisfied with our new signatures. If you had just said control dot and implement the interface, it would have created 3 new methods, probably. I'm not positive, and actually let's do this. Let's change team model back, hit Control Z twice. And now let's see what it does when I try to implement the interface. Right down here, void iData connection dot create team, and that's now the new method. So it created a new method for us, and it created it with a weird name, and that's because we have this issue up here where we already have a method called create team, and we can't have 2 methods called create team unless they have a different signature line. And the return type is not enough of a difference in signature for the system to tell them apart. Therefore, you can't have 2 with the same input type and different output types. So I just made one refactor. The refactor was I changed how these worked, and now I've changed my application. Now let's just make sure if we build a solution, let's see if anything fails, and it does. Down here in the create team form, if we go to the code, there should be an error in here somewhere, and of course there is. We have create person. Now it says cannot implicitly convert type void to person model. Why is that? Well, because we're actually trying to take the output of create person and assign it back to P. We don't need to do that. Now let's build again. And now the build succeeded. So with just those few changes, we have eliminated what's really a nagging issue. The idea that we're returning something we don't need to return. So that's the first thing that I wanted to get taken care of. The next thing I want to get taken care of is in text connection, we have all of these string constants. Now remember that we don't need these anymore. Let's close all our documents. We don't need these anymore because in our global config, there they are. And now they're accessible across our entire application. Therefore, let's get rid of these. And now it's going to yell at us and say, hey, I don't know what people file is. Well, we say globalconfig.peoplefile, it will now work. So we just add globalconfig dot on the front of any file name that has broken, and we should be good to go. Now let's save to prizes file. We probably don't need to have access to this file. So let's hit F12 here. And note that it takes in the file name, but we don't really need that because we have the global config. So therefore, we're going to come back to that, make a note of it. We'll come back to that and make sure we don't ever pass in file names. So we'll come back to that later. But for now, we'll continue on modifying our file. And again, for now, we'll pass in those files, but we will refactor that as well. And this is a little bit of wasted effort, but I want to do this to make sure I clear all my errors out. Because I really don't like changing multiple things at once, meaning we're changing the over to global configs for the file names. That's fine. It's essentially one change. But we don't want to wander off doing other changes as well, like those taking the file names out of the method signatures. So let's just make a note of that. We'll come back to that once we're done all of this. Now it says tournament file does not exist. Well, that's because you have to have globalconfig.tournament file. That takes care of that. And now if we do a build, we should be good. And the reason why I'm fairly confident we should be good is because those were private constants. Therefore, they should never have gone outside of this class. So now we can go over to the text connector processor and start taking care of these issues right here. Full file path, we pass in the file name. We're going to have to do that because that one is used for all the different files. So again, not going to change that one, not going to change this one. Load the file, whatever file it is. Not going to change that. But this right here, string people file name, don't need it. Now again, that may throw an error, and if it does, we can say people file, globalconfig.peoplefile, and that should now solve that problem. This one right here passes in 3 file names. We should be able to take care of all 3 of those, and then just rename these. So team file, not team file name. globalconfig.peoplefile. And this will be prize file. All right, and that's yelling at us right now because there is no prize file. So let's look at globalconfig real quick. We have the prizes file, it's plural. Now convert to team models only takes in, we need to take out that sending the file name. And now that works. All right, so now we've modified this all this code right here. Now saving to the prize file, we can take out the file name. Again, globalconfig.prizes file. Save people file. We can take that out. I want to modify the code in here. globalconfig.people file. Just make sure you get your file names correct when you are renaming these, because these are all called file name, which means you have to know based upon a method which file you need. If you're not sure, definitely double check. So we don't need those two file names. We don't need to pass in those file names. And we'll get to the matchup. It's down here, so we'll get there. These all look good. Matchup file and matchup entry file. We can get rid of those. We can get rid of the matchup entry file in the call. We're already using the global config down here for the matchup file. And we'll keep scrolling. Right now I'm just looking at the signatures of the methods to find where I have a file name in use or I'm pulling a file name in. Once I change that, I look in here for any errors that pop up where I have to change that name. Like here, it was already taken care of. There's the matchup entry file name. So here's another one we need to change. And that looks like the last one we need to change, but note that we have a whole bunch of red squigglies over here. So let's find out why. The first one's actually up here. In here we have an error. I find the easiest way to find that is to go right to it, double-clicking it. And here we're passing in a file name. We don't need to. We can pin this list to make it a little easier. We don't need that. We don't need that. This error list updates in real time, which is great because we can see as we make changes if we increase or decrease our errors. In this case, we wanted to see errors because we're calling those files all over, they're calling those methods all over, and passing those file names in all over. And so if we didn't see errors, that would mean we had done something wrong. So definitely don't freak out if you see errors. We'll take care of all those errors. And now it says we have no errors. Don't trust it though. Make sure you do a build. And it succeeded. So now I've moved all of those text connector, those files, whatever the text connection file name was, we moved all those constants over to the global config and made them public. So everyone has access to those same file names. Therefore, we've done that refactor. So now we've done two refactors, or two major ones. We have renamed all of our files over to be the new global config files. And we've updated all the methods that called those file names to now use the global config. And we've also modified our interface so that now it has the proper signatures without passing back those models that we didn't need to pass back in the first place. And we modified everywhere those are called so that we don't have a problem with calling them. So now we've done 2 major refactors, which is great. But now I want to move on to one more that I want to get done. And it's one that's been bugging me for a little bit. And if you've been paying attention to these videos, you'll probably know which one it is. If we come down here to our tournament viewer form and view code, and let's close out GlobalConfig. If you come down to this event down here, and you can tell which one it is when you start scrolling. That event. That's too much code for an event. It's doing too much, and really, there's logic in here I want to pull out into a method because we'll call it more than once. So the action here is the score button underscore click. So whenever you score a matchup, we do a whole bunch of stuff. Now, some of this is user interface stuff. You'll always have this in your user interface. So checking which value to pull out, which things to update based upon where it is on the form. Those kind of things are all UI driven. So if this form were entirely different, then it'd have to pull from different locations for Team 1 score and Team 2 score. That's fine. And also the idea that we update the model with the scores. That's fine. Even determining the winner could be okay. But I really think even that logic needs to be pushed out of the user interface. Remember, the goal here is to create an application that, while it's complete as it is, our customer has said that the Windows form idea is great for now, but in the future, we're going to maybe want to put this on the web, or maybe have a WPF interface, or something different. And so we don't want to have all the code in the user interface. It's not good anyways, but we want to push this into the library as much as possible so the UI just calls the library. Whatever it does, it just calls the library. And then the library takes care of everything else, including, do I call SQL or do I call the text file? Where do I put the stuff? How do I get it back out? How do I transform it? All that stuff is taken care of by the library so that the UI can just say, give me data. Now here's data back. And that's really all it should do in the user interface. So from line 201 down to the bottom, except for this line right here, the load matchup with a selected item. So everything else from 201 down to here, minus this line, all of this needs to get extracted into our class library, because this is all logic surrounding how to score the tournament matchup and how to promote the winner to the next round and how to mark the items as played. And so we're going to pass all of this off to another method. And we're going to put that method in the tournament logic. Now let's collapse these to definitions. So we have create rounds, create other rounds, create first round, number of bytes, find number of rounds, and randomize team order. These are all things that have to do with creating rounds right now for tournament logic. Notice this was the only one that's public. We're going to add another public method in here that has to do with scoring the tournament. Public static void. Let's call this update tournament results. And we'll pass in the tournament, not logic, tournament model. So the job of this method is going to be to do everything here. So let's copy this code. Let's paste it in here. Come back over. And I will delete all the lines except for the one I indicated. And now we'll say tournament logic dot update tournament results, and we'll pass in our tournament model. And our tournament model is what? Let's scroll to the very top, and we see that it's called tournament. We're passing the entire model in, not just the matchup we're working on. And the reason we're doing that is because we're working on the entire object. All right, so now we've got a little bit of broken logic here. So let's take care of that. And then instead of tournament.rounds, it's model.rounds. And if you notice, we still have some broken logic even here because we're dealing with the M, which was our matchup, which we didn't pass in. That was a specific matchup we just worked on. So let's actually comment this section now as well. We don't need this line. That's for our UI. And this line right here is going to actually update our specific matchup, but we don't know what that is yet. So let's look at what this does first, and then we'll adjust this logic to fit into a class environment instead of working on one specific matchup. So the first thing that happens is we're scoring if we have a score to give. Meaning, if we have 2 scores, then we need to mark one of the people as a winner. Therefore, we can do the same thing, but against all of the matchups in our entire model. And here's the reason why. When we first created our model, some teams had a bye week. Well, when you have a bye week, you automatically win that game. And now there is no game. And we got around that so far by actually giving the person with a bye week a score, 1 or whatever it is. We gave it to them. And we actually said score. So now they have a score of 1-0 when they didn't do anything. And that seems kind of hacky. And so one of the times that I want to call this update tournament results is right after the tournament gets created. Because at that point, we'll know if we have any buys. If we have buys, then all of those should be scored right away. Therefore, we call this and say run through the entire tournament and score everybody. So we're going to do that. To loop through our entire tournament, we have to loop through all of our rounds, just like we did down here. And we'll actually do this for each loop more than once. So for each round in rounds, then we're going to loop through each matchup in the round. And here's what I want to do. I want to create a list of matchup model called toScore. And this is going to be the matchups where we need to score them. So if, and this is where it's going to get a little tricky, so why don't you stick with me here. Normally down here, we did another for each on every matchup entry in our entries. And we said, okay, hey, if in this case the parent matchup is not null, then do this. But up here, all we care about is, do we have a score? So I'm going to do a little bit of link. So if rm.entries.any x equals greater than x dot score is greater than or less than 0. Actually, sorry, that was SQL. How about not equal 0? Much better. If any of the entries is not equal to 0, or rm.entries.count equals 1. Now, what am I doing here? So the first thing I do is I check to see if any of the entries have a score that is not equal to 0. So if we have completed a match, then we've put the value for the 2 scores in. We're not accepting ties for tournaments. Therefore, one team at least has to have a score different than 0. It can be negative or it can be positive. It just can't both be 0. So if any, as in either, if any entry matches this pattern, if any entry can say that's true for me, then we return a true. If none of them return this, but, there's our or, but the entries.count is 1, meaning we have a bye week. Remember, bye weeks don't get their own matchup entry. So if we have a bye week or we have a score, either way, we're going to add toScore.add RM. So we'll put them on the list. And if you notice I have a bug here, it's saying, hey, I can't do that. Cannot convert to this other signature. That's because that's an any, not add. Control J, A, D, D. There we go. So now I've added that matchup to my list that need to be scored. When this entire thing is complete, I will know which ones need to be scored. But there is one flaw here. And that flaw is that if we have a score, we may have already scored them, where we said this is the winner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if RM, let's get a little space here, RM dot winner is not equal to null, and I'll put this in parens. So if winner is not, or is equal to null, I'm sorry. So if winner is null, meaning we have not yet assigned a winner, and either one of their scores is not equal to 0, or there's only one entry. So if we have already scored them, we're going to ignore the rest of the stuff. So if the winner is not equal to null, if it's filled in, then the whole thing's going to fail no matter what. We'll skip over. And that just prevents any kind of issues we have with scoring the same winner over and over again. So now you've done all of this. Now down here we have a list of matchup model that we need to actually score. Now we can actually score these by looping through with our logic down here, where you say, okay, if this score or that score, how do you mark the winner? But I don't want to do that here. Instead, I'm going to call a private method. And so I'm going to call that private method, let's call it ScoreMatchups. We'll pass in a list of matchup model. And we'll call those models. I'm actually creating a signature line, which that's not what I'm supposed to do. So I'll copy that for later. And I'll pass in instead my toScore. Sometimes I think 3 steps ahead and forget what I'm doing right there. All right, so down here, I'm going to create that private static, and it's a void. Private static void ScoreMatchups. And now in here, I'm going to do essentially this logic. I'm going to say essentially because there's some tweaks to it I want to get done. And the first tweak I want to make is we said that if one score was greater than the other, that determined that the first score is the winner. So the one's greater than. But in golf, the lesser score wins. The score is lower. And at first you said, well, we're just going to deal with greater than for now. But now I'd like to go back and actually add that in since we're working on it right now. So what I'm going to do is actually go to my app.config and add a new key here. We already have one for our data. Oops. So I'll paste that in there. And instead of file path, it's going to be winner determination. And I will say that the initial value is greater. So this is saying that the score that's greater is the one that's going to be the winner. If I said lesser, it would be the score that is the lesser, the lower one. Now, you may be saying to yourself, now wait a minute, that means that our entire application can only do one direction for scoring, greater or less than. And that's true, but we are extracting the logic out into here. The next step would be to actually modify our model and store this information in the database. Then we could store it in the tournament model setup. We could say greater than or less than, or high score wins, low score wins, and pass it in that way. And then we could just change it from pulling from the app config to change it to pull from the tournament model. So that gets us pretty close. I'm not going to go into actually adding it to the tournament model just because we'd have to change a lot of different places. We need to change our text files, our SQL data structure, our store procedures, and some of our code. So that's a pretty big change to do, and I really don't want to get into that and take up too much of our time. When we've seen how to do it, it's just a matter of doing it. So instead, I'm just going to put it here. That gets us all the new logic for greater than or less than, and then wherever you pull it from is up to you. So in our app.config, I have winner determination, the value is greater. And that's just a key string. So how do we pull this winner determination? We already have the logic for that. If we go back over to our text connector, this full file path, if we hit F12, there is the code for pulling that value. It's actually right here. So we can take this code, come back over here, and say string score direction equals, but instead of the file path, we want to pull in the winner determination. And so they can't find a configuration manager, I hit Control dot, add the using statement, and now we're good to go. And so the values here should be greater or lesser. Now, using magic strings is always a little bit concerning. So there's a couple things we could do. One, instead of saying greater or lesser, we could say 1 or -1. But that gets kind of confused with Boolean. We could do a Boolean and say greater wins, and then we have a true or false value. And what I would do for that is I would say 1 or 0, since this is a string. And I kind of like that a little better. That way, greater wins is either 1 or a 0. It's either true or false. And so what we'll say is that if it's 0, it's false. Otherwise, whatever it is, it's true. That way, by default, it will be greater. All right. So we're going to say greater wins. We'll call the same name as our actual app setting. Now we're going to say is, we're going to do an if statement here. If greater wins equals 0. And it can't be 0, it's got to be 0 inside of a string. There we go. So 0 means false or low score wins. So we'll start with a low score first, because that way we'll do an else statement down here. And now this is for 1 means true or high score wins. And so that just flips the bit for us to say 1 or 0. The key here is I said 0 equals 0. The only way to say low score wins is to have this be 0. Any other value, anything, we'll set it to be high score wins. And since that's what the majority of games do, then we're going to go ahead and set that way. We'll set the default to be the one that is most likely true. Now what we're going to do is take this logic now and put it in each of these sections. So, if, and here's the problem now, is we have a list of matchup, not one particular matchup. So before we go any further, let's wrap this entire thing to a surround with for each. So we'll say the for each is matchup model. And the value, let's call this M. In, my tabs don't work for some reason this time. That's okay. For M in models. All right, so now we can say if, this is going to loop through every time for every matchup where we have to mark a winner. And so we're going to say if M dot and if we continue on this, we'd say entries, and the first one and the score is greater than m.entries.1.score. And actually, this should be less than, because it's the low score wins. Then in here, following this logic down here, we would say m.winner equals m.entries 0.teamcompeting. So if the first entry, if its score is lower than the second entry score, the winner is the first entry's team. Now, have you seen the flaw in our logic yet? This will only work if we have 2 entries. What about bye weeks? Well, that's where we need to have a separate case for the bye week. Now we could wrap this entire thing in our if statement, but that gets kind of tedious going that many layers deep into loops and ifs and all the rest. So instead what I'm going to do is say if m dot entries dot count is less than, let's just say equals 1. That we're absolutely sure what we're doing. If we have one entry, let's put a note up here. I don't do a ton of code comments, but I do comment when things are a little tricky or when I want to give an example of what's going on. So in this case, this is for bye week. So in a bye week, what we'll do is say m.winner equals m.entries 0. Dot team competing. All right, so we take the first entry, since it's a bye week, therefore they're automatically scored as the winner. The problem is now I'm still going to go through and hit this next if statement, unless I do continue. And continue's job is to continue this for each at the next iteration. Think of it kind of like a break, but it doesn't exit entirely. So a break in this situation would say, okay, the for each is done. Go on down here. The continue says this loop, this particular iteration is done. Go on to the next one. So that works for us. So now we check for by. Then down here we check to see if we have, if team number 0 was the winner. And then we can either check, just say that the other team is the winner, if that's what we're going to say, or we could say that we don't do ties. Now down here we did the else if because of ties. And I think I like that logic still. I don't like the idea of allowing a tie through with one team advancing. And so in that case, I'm going to go ahead and actually do the same logic. We'll just need to deal with what to do if there is a problem. So else if, and we'll continue on in the same logic. We'll just copy and paste this and change around the numbers. Now we could change, and that's not 2, it's 0. We could change this symbol, which would be quicker, but if we're matching patterns, then you'll see that the pattern is the team in front is the winner. The team in front is the winner. Just makes it a little easier for looking at things, in my opinion. And that's up to you. So now we have this else statement. And what do we do here? Well, we really shouldn't go any further in saving this data. I really think that we should be done at this point and say, you know what? No, we're complete. We can't go any further until you handle your business. So we should do a throw new exception. I'm going to type out exception. Here's what I do. There's a number of different exceptions that Microsoft provides. And the great thing is they're pretty descriptive in their names. So for example, unauthorized access exception. Can you guess what that's for? Probably for accessing something you don't have access to. And so what I do is I scroll through here and say, does anything really match the issue I'm having that I'm throwing an error for? And so I'll scroll up here. I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time on this because really it is up to you. You're the one capturing it. We could say it's a format exception if we want. We could even throw just an exception if we find that there's not really a value or an exception type that matches up exactly with what you want. Array type mismatch, argument out of range, null, argument exception. But that's usually for methods. Application exception, a non-fatal error. Well, that's kind of it, but let's just do exception. Notice we have 3 overloads here. We can pass in nothing, a message, or a message and inner exception. Let's just pass in a message and say, we do not allow ties in this application. Now you could say to yourself, well, wait a minute, what if we had 2 zeros? Well, that would never be matched as a completed entry because at least one of those values has to be a non-zero in order to even get into this list. So now we've handled the one type. That's all of this, but only for the lower score wins. So now we can do when the high score wins. We can copy the same logic, paste it down below, And now we change the signs. And that way it's still the same team that goes through, but now it's because this score is greater than this score. So that's the same logic. Now we've marked the winner for every single matchup. And let's, instead of score matchup, let's call this mark winners in matchups. We can come up here and change that call. So we've marked the winners for the matchups. Now what we need to do is go through and actually update the parents then for the next round. So you've won the first round. Now you get moved into the second round, if there is one. So move advance winners. We'll leave it at that. We'll pass in that same list. Let's call it right here. Private static void advanced winners. List of matchup model called models. And now in here, we're going to do this logic. So we're going to loop through every round in our rounds. And we're going to say, okay, we got to find every matchup in every round. And inside there, every matchup entry. And say if your parent matchup is not null and it matches this m.id. Well, that would be the model, one model in this list of models. So we'll need to put another loop on the outside of this that loops through every model and does all of this. So it should actually be pretty simple because we should say surround with for each, and we'll say matchup model, and we'll call it M in models. Now I called it M specifically because I knew that down in here we had called our matchup M. Therefore, all this code should work. The only thing we have a problem with is this model.rounds. And that's actually the tournament itself. We have to pass the tournament in here. So let's do that. So I'll say tournament model, tournament. Instead of model here, I'll say tournament.rounds. Now up here, we have to pass in our tournament model. And now we've again satisfied that signature. So now we've looped through every matchup and said for every matchup, look through every round and every matchup in every round and find every entry in every matchup. And if the parent matchup is not null, check to see if it matches the current model we're on, the matchup model. If that ID matches, that's where the winner advances to. Now don't forget, this is a curated list of models. This is only the matchups, the matchup models that have been marked as we need to score them. Therefore, they have been all been given a winner. Therefore, by this point, we know that every single one of them knows who their winner is, so we can put that winner into the team competing of the next round. And note down here that we save the matchup itself. And the reason it saves the matchup, notice as the RM here, which is a matchup model, not just the matchup entry, is because this save for matchup also saves the matchup entries inside of it. It does both jobs. So that's all good. And so really, we're done with this logic. We're able to port it over just by adding this for each here. But up here, we still have this one line. And that one line is to update the matchup. Remember, M was the matchup where we're scoring. Well, down here we did all the scoring, but we never actually saved the matchup. And I think the logical place to do that is when you mark a matchup winner. Because if something is marked as winner, we should probably save it. The only question I have, though, is for these throw new exceptions. Imagine a scenario where somehow we passed in a tie of 1. We shouldn't, the friend shouldn't allow it, but say it did. We get to this point, we score, say, 3 entries, 3 matchups, and they all score fine. The 4th one we get to, it goes, yeah, tie. Throw no exception. Well, that means that we don't do anything after that. We crash the application back to the UI and say, hey, there's a problem. Well, in that case, we will have saved some winners to the database and marked them as having a winner. The problem with that is when we try and find the matchups we need to score, we look to make sure the winner is null. So we'll have items marked with a winner of not null, and yet their parent, or their child, the second round, won't have the team competing because it was never passed through, because that comes after we mark the winners. Therefore, I think what I'd like to do is I would like to instead update the matchup for each of my list in the toScore after I advance the winners. At that point, I know everything is set. I can mark these as having winners. So let's do that right here. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different just to show you can do it. One way you could do it would be a for each right here. Do a for each on the score and say for each item in the score, run this globalconfig.connection.update matchup. But there's an easier or at least shorter way of doing it. We can say toScore dot for each. We'll say x equals greater than globalconfig.connection.update matchup x. In that one line, I've done this line for every one of the items in the list of matchup model toScore. So how does that work? Well, it's just a for each. It's really all it is. And it's really just a function that's shortened down. So instead of declaring all of that syntax for each item in list, do this code, we have shortened it down to, here's the variable name in the for each, here's the code to do. That's it. So that line is functionally equivalent to saying for each matchup model X in toScore globalconfig.connection.update model X. This one right here is the same as this one right there. This one just takes out all this stuff that it really doesn't need to have. It knows it's doing a for each, therefore it says, I can do a var here. I don't care about the type because I can figure that out. So I don't need that. And it says, you've already told me which one to search through, so I don't need that. That's right here. It's an extension method of that. And you've already told me for each, so I don't need that. I don't need the curly braces because I can just do it in a one line. That's cool. And so it says, okay, I don't need the semicolon either. There. That's all I need. So, X into code. Done. And now you can call this method from anywhere at any time to update our tournament results. For example, in here, we have a tournament model being created. At the very end of this, after the first round is created with the buys, if there are any, we can say update tournament results model. And now we've updated that tournament to make sure that any buys are moved into the next round. And then also behind our form, we can call that as well, which we've already done. So now let's start this again. And instead of loading a tournament, let's create one. And we'll call this testing tourney. Entry fee of 10. Team first place, uncanny losers, and Sue's team. That sounds great. We'll set no prizes for this one. We'll create the tournament. Notice nothing happened. That's because we didn't actually wire this button up to do anything yet. It creates a tournament, but it doesn't actually go anywhere from here. We need to fix that. So let's actually fix that before we go any further. So we'll close out everything. Come down to our UI. Go to our Create Tournament form. At the button, we have to do something now. And this is where we need to do the same thing that we do on our dashboard. When we call, let's just open up so you can see it, Load Tournament button. We're going to do the same code right here. So I actually copied that, and then I pasted it in. Now we already have a tournament model. We don't need to load that. So we create a new tournament viewer form, pass in TM, which is our tournament model, show that, and then we'll also say this.close. So now it should be that this form closes after it opens the tournament viewer form. Let's try this out. So notice we have our testing tourney. We'll try one more though, just to make sure we have this part of it working. Entry fee of 10. Add our teams. This is called another test. Let's create our tournament. Notice it closed and this window opened. Tournament, another test. And now we have two teams here. Let's check for the ones that are unplayed. Notice that even though team first place was here, and it's a bye, if we check the unplayed only, they go away because they're already marked as having played that game. And if we come to round 2, we'll notice that this one's not marked yet, but it's team first place versus team first place. That doesn't seem right. So now we've got to figure out why that is. Let's first score this. Actually, let's not change anything right yet. Instead, let's look at the data. So we're using SQL. So let's first go look at our teams. Let's just do a query window here instead. It makes it a little easier. I wish that query windows would start with a whole bunch of lines already in them, because I don't like the idea of having to go down below and put more lines, especially since if you have no lines in, let's just cut this out for a minute, and I say select star from, and I want to highlight this, I can't come down below or go above. It's messy. And so I like to paste in a whole bunch of lines, or put in a whole bunch of lines, so I can just click down here and up here and put stuff where I want them. Select star from dbo.teams. Let's just see what that has to hold for us. We have 3 teams, that's great. Now let's look at the tournaments. So there's our another test, that's great, it's active. Now let's look at our matchups for this tournament, tournament number 4. So, matchups where tournament ID, not entries, tournament ID equals 4. And we have 3 entries. We don't have a winner marked in any of them, which is interesting because we do have a bye week in here. So let's figure out what's going on there. So let's look at matchup entries. And matchup entries links based off of matchup ID. So let's look at those matchup IDs again. Is 10, 11, and 12. Where matchup entry between 10 and 12. And that's yelling at me because it's not the right column. So it's matchup ID. Matchup ID. So the matchup ID is between 10 and 12. Give me those values. So if you notice down here, the parent matchup kind of gives it away. This is the second round. So in this case, the second round, the parent matchup is 10 and 11. And the team competing is 1 for both of those. That's interesting. That doesn't seem right. It seems like we should have that to be null for team competing until we mark a winner. And don't forget, let's run both of these. We don't have any winners marked for any of them. Therefore, how can we say that one is the winner versus the other? So team competing in this first matchup is number 1. And that's the one getting passed through to the second round for both matchups. So we're going to kind of trace this down in our application, but it seems like we're writing bad data and some of our logic we just didn't quite work. So let's close this out. And let's go over to our tournament logic and actually start right here when we're updating our tournament results based upon the newly created tournament. So let's start this again. Let's say create tournament. I'll call this the debug tourney. We'll say the entry fee is 13. We'll add 3 teams. We'll say create tournament. Now here you have a tournament model. Let's zoom in on it and say, okay, what are the values here? We have 3 entered teams. That's good. Sue's team, Uncanny Losers, and team first place. Note you can also pin this over here. Kind of makes it a little easier because then it's always over here. Next, let's inspect these rounds. So the first round has 2 matchups in it. The second matchup, and I go down the bottom one first so I can go up, and it just works a little better with the UI here. But the second matchup is team first place versus Uncanny Losers. Matchup round is 1. Notice the matchup ID is 0. We haven't actually saved this to the database yet. That's going to be kind of interesting because we're down below, we're saving information to the database. And so that, I think, is going to be a problem. So we have, round 0. The first one, we have 2 entries. Again, matchup ID, or the ID is 0. So therefore, we've got some problems to deal with before we can even get to the team ID is correct. Before we can even get to anything else, we have to deal with the fact this isn't saved yet. So we called this at the wrong spot because that record isn't saved yet. And if it's not saved yet, then we can't update it. Because we're updating stuff that just doesn't work. So let's go back to where we started from, the Create Tournament form, double click on our button here, go all the way through until we see the Create Tournament. And this should actually save our tournament. Note that over here in the tournament logic, that's not what we're calling here. We're calling the globalconfig.connection.create tournament. That's where the actual update happens. It calls the tournament logic. Therefore, what we can do is after we create the tournament, now we can update our tournament results. Now it's going to yell at us and say, no, you can't do that. And that's because we haven't added the using statement, or we don't have access to that value outside of the tournament logic. We have to say tournament logic dot. And now we can pass in our tournament model. And I think that should work. And I'm pretty happy with it, but not totally satisfied. And the reason why is I shouldn't have to say, okay, now that you created a tournament, now update it. The UI shouldn't really care. So I'm still not in love with this. I'm going to cut it back out and go over to the Create Tournament, which is actually in two different spots. Over here, let's look for Create Tournament. Now here's the call for saving the tournament, the prizes, the entries, and the rounds. Now we can pass this in, and it's again model. And here, this way, we are saving everything and then updating those bye weeks. So that feels more natural. But don't forget, over in Text Connector, we also have a Create Tournament. And once we save to the text file, we then paste it in. And again, it's called model, so we're good to go. So now let's test this one more time, and hopefully this time we'll have squashed those bugs. It's always important to test what you're doing. This one's probably broken. Another test, because that's when we had that issue in the code. But let's create a new one anyway. We'll call this one Logic Fixed. We'll say $14 entry fee. We'll add our 3 teams. We'll create our tournament. And now it pops up with our tournament. If we check this, we only get the second game because the first one is a bye. In round 2, we've not yet determined, but team first place is in the first slot because team first place was the one that had the bye. Therefore, if we mark this one as Uncanny Losers wins, now there's no unplayed for round 1, and round 2 is team first place versus Uncanny Losers. Excellent. And now not only do we refactor our code to put it in the right spot, take it out of the UI and put it into our class library, we also made some tweaks to it so that it did the job a little better and it handled things a little more intelligently. And so that's part of the refactoring. Part of refactoring is just making your code run smoother or look smoother in the way you lay it out. But part of it is also rewriting how you do things to do them better, or to handle more edge cases, or to fix problems that would otherwise pop up. So those are the 2 parts of refactor we need to do. And in this case, we've done both of those. Now, there's probably a lot more I could do in this application in order to refactor it to be even better. But those are the big ones that I want to tackle today. I want to tackle cleaning up some of that stuff that was just kind of leftovers, the mess we created when we first started, when we changed our logic. And I also wanted to tackle that one area where bye weeks weren't being handled properly, and we had extra code in our front end that really should have been in our back end in the class library. So next, what we're going to do is move right into error handling and how do we deal with that. So stick around for that.